They say there are truths you can't unhear, secrets that once spoken dig their claws into your mind and never let go. What I'm about to tell you is one of them. A century and a half ago, in the dead heart of a Vermont winter, something walked out of the mountains. Not a man, not a beast, but something in between. His name was Samuel Hawthorne. Though no one ever found a birth record, no family name, no trace of him in any census, parish registry, or graveyard. And yet, for 5 brutal months, he ruled the small town of Millbrook without a crown, without an army, without ever raising his voice. Understand this, the people of that town didn't just welcome him, they surrendered to him, not because of fear, but because of need. That's the most dangerous kind of power. It was February 18th, 1847. The cold was a living thing, gnawing at bone and sanity alike. 17 had already frozen to death across Windham County, and the snow was so deep it erased the edges of the world. And then, he appeared. A dark figure cutting through the blizzard, walking like the storm itself parted for him. No staggering, no struggle, just deliberate steps, as if he knew exactly where every drift and hollow lay. People gathered at the windows of Prescott's general store, pressing their faces to the glass, watching this stranger advance against winds strong enough to bend pine trunks. When he stepped into view, they saw clothes no one could place. A long coat of treated hide that shed snow like water, boots that left patterned tracks no trapper recognized, layers of woven fabric that shimmered faintly in the lamplight like metal turned to cloth. But it wasn't the clothing that unnerved them, it was him. He was tall, a head above most men, with sharp, angular features and hair streaked with white, far too soon for his apparent age. His eyes, pale blue, almost colorless, like a frozen lake with something moving far beneath. And when those eyes landed on you, you didn't feel looked at, you felt measured. Dr. Ezekiel Putnam, the town physician, swore the man showed no frostbite, no hypothermia, no fatigue, despite claiming to have been walking for days through killing weather. When asked where he came from, he spoke of valleys beyond the peaks, where the sun was different, where the old ways still ruled, where survival meant accepting nature's cruelties without flinching. And when pressed further, he smiled, not kindly, and changed the subject. That night, a girl named Sarah Thornbury began coughing in the inn's common room, a deep, tearing cough that had plagued her for weeks. Hawthorne reached into a leather satchel that never left his side and produced a vial of dark liquid smelling of pine and something sweet, almost rotten. 3 drops in warm water, he told her. Within an hour, the cough was gone. By morning, she breathed like she'd never been sick at all. Word spread through Millbrook before the sun was fully up. The man who'd come out of the storm could heal. By sundown, half the town stood outside the inn, waiting for his medicines. And that was how it began. They didn't know it yet, but Samuel Hawthorne hadn't just walked into their lives. He had stepped into their weaknesses and begun rewriting the rules of who would live and who would not. Control doesn't start with chains or threats. It starts with dependency. The most efficient tyrant doesn't need to command you. He just needs to become the only source of what you can't live without. Samuel Hawthorne understood this better than anyone in Millbrook. In those first days after his arrival, the town's desperation was a door left unlocked, and he walked right through it. Dr. Putnam still had a few remedies left, laudanum, quinine, crude herbal tinctures, but the shelves were bare enough that any hope of lasting the winter was fading fast, and here was a man who could pull life from death, who could treat frostbite without amputation, stop fevers before they broke the body, ease pains that had crippled the strongest loggers. But Hawthorne never gave his cures freely, he gave them strategically. If you were the kind of person others listened to, the merchant, the preacher, the mill foreman, he treated you first. Quietly, efficiently, in a way that left you speaking his praises before the day was done. If you were less influential, you still got your remedy, but only after you'd waited in the cold, after you'd seen how quickly the important people were ushered past you. It wasn't cruelty, it was calculation. He was mapping the social hierarchy of Millbrook and adjusting it. Within a week, the town's unspoken chain of command had shifted. Not toward the minister, not toward the doctor, not toward the wealthy farmers. Toward him. Hawthorne kept a ledger, not of debts in coin, debts in life. Every drop of his medicine, every dressing of a wound, every cure for a child's fever was marked in that strange, looping handwriting no one could quite read. When asked why he kept such records, he'd smile and say, "Where I come from, we count the living the way you count grain. It tells you what the winter has taken and what it still owes." And then there were his absences. He'd vanish into the blizzard for hours, sometimes overnight, and return with fresh meat, green herbs, and materials the town hadn't seen since autumn. He never said where they came from, and no one could follow his tracks for long before the snow erased them. Some swore they heard voices when they tried, faint, mournful voices carried on the wind, and they always turned back before reaching the tree line. By late February, a dangerous shift had taken hold. The people no longer asked if Hawthorne could help. They asked when. The minister's sermons grew shorter, the doctor's authority thinner, and even the wealthiest farmers stopped hoarding their own supplies, quietly trading food or labor for a vial from Hawthorne's satchel. This wasn't charity. It was architecture. He was building something, a network of loyalty, one act of salvation at a time, and the brilliance of it was simple. Once you'd accepted his help, you couldn't imagine surviving without it. I tell you this because men today still fall for the same design. Replace medicine with money, with information, with access to power, and you'll see it everywhere. The ones who want control will feed you just enough to keep you alive, but never enough to set you free. Millbrook didn't see it. Not yet. They thought they had found a savior in the storm. But by the end of that winter, they would learn that Samuel Hawthorne hadn't saved them at all. He had claimed them. The first warnings came quietly. Not in screams, not in sudden deaths, but in whispers, in changes so subtle that most chalked them up to the strain of the winter. Yet, when you look back, you see the pattern. The kind of pattern that only becomes obvious when it's already too late. Sarah Thornbury, the girl Hawthorne had cured on his first night in town, stopped coughing entirely. To anyone else, she was the picture of health. But Grace Thornbury, her mother, noticed things. The way Sarah woke in the night, sitting straight up in bed, eyes open, staring at the dark as though she were listening to something far away. The way her appetite changed, not larger, not smaller, but specific. She craved meat, even for breakfast, and when she got it, she ate it almost raw. Grace told no one at first. After all, her daughter was alive, wasn't she? The same week, Jeremiah Prescott, the merchant, found his joints no longer ached in the cold. He called it a miracle, but his wife Abigail confided to a neighbor that Jeremiah had begun locking the pantry at night, not to keep others out, but because he himself couldn't seem to stop eating. He would wake with grease on his hands, swearing he'd only gone for water. And then there was young Timothy, Jeremiah's son, the boy who had first spotted Hawthorne in the blizzard. The lad's vision seemed sharper now. He could spot movement on the ridgeline half a mile away, but his temper had shifted too. He snapped at his mother, glared at the minister in church, and one afternoon was caught staring at the schoolmaster's neck with an expression no one could quite name. Hawthorne never drew attention to these changes. In fact, he seemed to encourage the town to focus only on the recoveries. The cured lungs, the mended joints, the vanished fevers. If the sickness is gone, he told them, then life has returned. Don't pick at the stitches when the wound is already closed. It was Dr. Putnam who first suspected something was wrong. He kept meticulous notes on every patient he treated, and on every patient Hawthorne touched. After 3 weeks, those notes revealed something that didn't sit right. The physical recovery was too fast. Fevers broke within hours instead of days. Frostbite reversed in a single night. Wounds closed without scarring. That wasn't medicine. That was something else. But Putnam's problem was the same one any man faces when the truth is inconvenient. No one wanted to hear it. You could show them the facts, and they'd look right past them because belief is easier than doubt when your survival's on the line. Meanwhile, Hawthorne's hold deepened. The ledger he kept was growing thicker, and his absences became longer. Sometimes he'd be gone for a full day and night, returning with that same impossible freshness, herbs out of season, meat that looked like no deer or rabbit the hunters recognized. He'd cook it himself, doling it out in precise portions, always with that same phrase, strength for the days ahead. What Millbrook didn't understand was that strength always has a cost. Sometimes you pay in coin, sometimes in loyalty, and sometimes in pieces of yourself you never get back. By the time the first villager disappeared, they were already too far under his shadow to turn back. There are moments in the history of the Sullivan Institute that should never have survived the passage of time, moments whispered only in corners, passed from trembling mouth to trembling ear, so faint that even the walls seemed to lean in to listen. This is one of them. The year was 1852. By then, Reverend Nathaniel Gray's influence had reached beyond the Institute and into the parlors of the city's elite. He was a celebrated man, a preacher of divine authority, a teacher of unmatched discipline, and to those who dared question him, a ruler whose smile was just as dangerous as his wrath. But inside the Institute, something strange was happening. The children had stopped speaking. Not all at once, not in a way anyone could chart. It began with a few bright-eyed pupils who, within weeks, became hollow and watchful, their mouths clamped shut as though they had swallowed their own voices. Teachers claimed it was a phase, a result of deep contemplation instilled by the Reverend's lessons on obedience and restraint. But those who worked in the kitchens, they knew better. At night, when the corridors were dark and the gas lamps hummed faintly, the children would gather in small clusters. They wouldn't talk. They would lean close, so close their foreheads nearly touched, and they would whisper, not in English, not in any known language. It was a breathy, rhythmic murmur, more like a chant, a sound that made the hairs on the nape of the neck rise, and they did it in perfect unison. It was the laundress, Mrs. Emery, who first told the story of the night she saw them. She had been sent to fetch a dropped kerchief from the third-floor study hall. The door was ajar. The moonlight stretched in long silver fingers across the desks. And there they were. 15 children standing in a circle, heads bowed, whispering their strange litany into the dark. When she gasped, they all stopped at once. Every head turned toward her slowly together, and their eyes glistened like the surface of black water. She ran. She never went back to that floor. And yet she wasn't the only one to hear them. Years later, one of the Institute's former tutors, who had long since fled Charleston, claimed that Reverend Gray would sometimes enter these whispering circles himself, that he would kneel in the middle, close his eyes, and let the children press their hands to his head and shoulders, as though transferring some invisible power. What they gave him, no one could say, but after those nights, Gray's sermons were different, harder, heavier, more intoxicating. People left his chapel dazed, unsure if they had been blessed or bound. By spring, the whispering had spread to every child in the Institute. It was no longer something hidden. They would whisper as they walked between classes, as they sat in the dining hall, as they filed into the chapel. Visitors found it unnerving, so much so that a wealthy patron withdrew his funding, calling the place an experiment in unnatural piety. But Gray did not care. In his mind, the children were not losing their voices. They were learning to speak to something greater, and whatever that something was, it was listening. What no one outside the Institute knew was this: the whispers were not random. They formed patterns, phrases that, when mapped by one brave groundskeeper, revealed dates. Dates of deaths, dates of disappearances, and, chillingly, dates of events that had not yet happened, but did. The Reverend claimed it was a sign of divine prophecy. The few who tried to expose it called it something else entirely, a communion with the abyss. From that year on, the Charleston Institute was no longer simply a school. It had become a hive, a living, breathing entity of murmured secrets, and Nathaniel Gray was at its center and drinking them all in. Because in Charleston, power was not taken with swords or sermons. It was whispered, in the dark, They said the mansion had only 4 floors, but the night Henry Caldwell first walked those upper halls, he found himself standing before a narrow spiral staircase, one that wasn't marked on any blueprint. The air there was warmer, heavier, as if the walls themselves were breathing. The steps creaked under his boots, the sound echoing in a way that made him feel watched. At the top he reached a locked iron door. Its handle was cold, wet, almost alive. Behind it, faint murmurs leaked through the cracks, like voices trapped under water. He pressed his ear closer and caught fragments, numbers, names, and something else, prayers twisted into commands. Henry returned with tools 2 nights later, prying the door open with a crowbar. The room beyond was small, circular, and lined with shelves that reached the ceiling. Each shelf was filled with ledgers, maps, and glass jars, jars that contained things no man could name. Some held dried herbs, others bits of bone, but the ones in the far corner held human eyes. Dozens of them, floating in a cloudy liquid, staring at nothing, or maybe at him. In the center stood a single high-backed chair facing a narrow window slit overlooking the grounds. The chair was draped with a black cloth, and beneath it sat a rusted box, no bigger than a bread loaf. When Henry forced it open, he found a stack of letters, bound with a leather strap. They were written in code, jagged, angular symbols, but a few words in plain English stood out. Seal the mouth. Keep the hunger buried. The others must not wake. As Henry read, something shifted in the shadows behind him. He turned, but the room was empty. Yet the iron door, which had been wide open, slammed shut on its own. The sound was like a cannon in that cramped space. A chill spread from his fingertips to his spine. The window slit was too narrow to escape, and the air felt thinner by the second. Then he heard it again, the murmurs. But now they were inside the room. Soft at first, then louder, swirling around him, speaking in that same coded tongue. Henry clutched the letters, certain they were the reason for this room's secrecy. He didn't know it yet, but what he held wasn't just evidence. It was an invitation, the kind you can't refuse and can't survive without paying a price. When he finally forced the door back open and fled down the spiral steps, he could still hear them whispering, not behind him, but inside him. The tower room had chosen him, and once chosen, you are never forgotten. Henry didn't sleep for 2 nights. The voices from the tower room were still there, whispering in his dreams, shaping them into long corridors where doors opened to rooms he had never seen, yet knew existed. By the 3rd night, he spread the coded letters across his desk, determined to break them. The cipher was unlike anything he'd seen in his years of studying historical documents. The symbols curved in unnatural ways, like they had been drawn by a hand that didn't quite understand human writing. Some marks looked like inverted numbers, others like small hooks, each repeated in disturbing sequences. At first he thought they were merely an obscure merchant code, but when he overlaid the patterns with an old nautical chart of the Charleston coastline, the symbols aligned perfectly with burial sites, unmarked ones. The letters weren't just messages, they were maps. It took him hours, but he managed to decode a single sentence in one of the oldest pages. When the black tide rises, the mouths must open and the debt must be fed. Henry stared at the words, unsettled. What mouths? What debt? Then he noticed something he had missed before. Each page had a reddish-brown smudge in the corner. He scraped one with a razor blade and realized it wasn't ink. It was blood, human blood. And not dried centuries ago. It was still faintly moist. He remembered the jars in the tower room, the eyes suspended in cloudy liquid. They weren't trophies, they were keys. That night, he lit a lamp and read on. The further he translated, the more the words seemed to twist in his mind. The instructions were precise, describing a ritual that involved water, moonlight, and a living witness whose blood has not yet cooled. It became clear. This was no ordinary history. This was a set of operating rules for something ancient, something still alive beneath the Caldwell estate. Around night, a knock came at his door, soft, measured, 3 taps, then silence. He called out, but no one answered. When he opened the door, there was no one in the hallway, only a small cloth-wrapped object on the floor. Inside the cloth was one of the glass jars from the tower room, but the eye floating inside it was new. It was blue. It was human, and Henry recognized it instantly. It was the same eye he had seen in the mirror every day of his life. Henry didn't scream. He wanted to. The sight of his own eyes staring up at him in that cloudy fluid should have shattered his sanity, but something colder than fear took over. It wasn't shock. It was recognition. The jar in his hand felt heavier than glass should, as though the liquid inside had a pull of its own. The pupil shifted slightly, as if following his breath. Then, somewhere deep in the Caldwell estate, the floorboards groaned, not with the weight of footsteps, but with the slow, deliberate sound of a drawn breath. The house was inhaling. Henry placed the jar on the desk and stepped back, scanning the room. The air felt thicker now, humid like a storm cellar before the rain. His lamp flickered, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to move against the walls. A low hum began, so faint it might have been his own heartbeat in his ears, but it grew, vibrating through the floor, through his bones, until he realized the sound was not coming from inside him, but from below him. The letters on the desk shifted. He hadn't touched them, but the pages had rearranged themselves into a perfect circle, the bloodstains on the corners aligned, forming a ring. It wasn't a cipher anymore. It was a seal. And seals were meant to keep something in. From somewhere far beneath the estate, he heard the slow drip of water. It was followed by something worse, a dragging sound, wet and steady, as if something enormous was crawling through a flooded tunnel. The hum deepened. The lamp went out. And in the dark, Henry saw it. Not with his eyes, but with the same mind that had been invaded since the first night in the tower room. A vision. The ocean outside Charleston, black and endless, rising and swelling, carrying with it a mouth wider than the horizon. Inside that mouth, teeth the size of buildings gnashing in hunger. He knew then what the black tide in the L. Etters meant. The Caldwell estate wasn't just a house, it was a lung, and every breath it took was keeping something in the deep alive. The knock came again, 3 slow taps. But this time the sound wasn't from the door. It was from inside the walls. The sound moved like water, trickling through the plaster, finding every hollow space. Henry held his breath and pressed his ear to the wall. It wasn't knocking anymore. It was speaking. Not in English, not in any language he could name. The syllables came in uneven bursts, wet and bubbling, as though spoken through something viscous. Each sound carried weight, pressing into his skull. And then, his mind translated, "You have his blood." Henry stumbled back. The voice had bypassed his ears entirely. The walls themselves seemed to bulge inward and then exhale, the wood groaning as if under strain. He traced the sound to the far corner, where an old wardrobe leaned against the plaster. The air around it felt colder. Not the absence of heat, but the presence of something that didn't belong. He gripped the wardrobe's edge and pulled. It didn't budge. The voice came again, closer now, its tone like a whisper dragged over rusted metal. "Open the way, or the tide will open you." The wardrobe shifted an inch. Behind it the plaster was stained dark, as though something had been seeping through for years. The marks weren't random, they formed a spiral, and at the spiral's center was a faint, deliberate gouge in the wall, a mark shaped like an eye. Henry remembered the jar, the cloudy liquid, his own eyes staring back. It wasn't a specimen. It was a key. The house inhaled again, a long, rattling breath, and the voice poured into his skull like cold water down his spine. "They promised me his son. They sent me you." Henry's hands trembled. He didn't want to understand, but the name was already forming in his mind. Caldwell's debt, his own father's visits to this place, the sudden inheritance of land nobody wanted. The truth was unavoidable. His family had been paying something, and now the collector had found him. The wardrobe creaked forward. just enough for him to see it, a seam in the wall that pulsed as though flesh had grown over wood. Something beneath it was breathing back. The voice came one last time, sharper now, like it was right behind his ear. "Do you know my name?" The floor shuddered. Somewhere below, water rushed upward through hidden channels, and Henry realized he did know the name, but saying it aloud would be the last thing he ever did. The boards beneath Henry's feet felt thin, like they were straining under something heavy moving beneath them. The wardrobe now stood fully away from the wall, exposing the breathing seam, pale, waxy, and warm to the touch. He hesitated only a moment before pressing his palm flat against it. It pulsed once, and split. The seam widened with a wet tear, revealing a narrow stairwell carved from black, salt-slick stone. The air that rose from below carried the stench of rotting kelp and something sweeter, metallic, the smell of a wound left to fester. He took a lantern from the desk, lit it, and began to descend. The steps were uneven, some worn nearly to nothing, as though hundreds of years of footsteps had worn them down. The further he went, the more the sound of rushing water surrounded him. But it wasn't the sea. This was closer, deeper, like a river that ran directly beneath the estate. At the bottom, the stairway opened into a vaulted chamber. The walls glistened with moisture, and in the center stood a stone basin the size of a small boat. It was filled, not with water, but with a thick, brackish liquid that rippled even without movement. Chains hung from the ceiling above the basin. Some were rusted through, some were slick with fresh salt. Henry approached slowly, the lantern light trembling in his grip. As it touched the surface of the liquid, something moved beneath, large, slow, deliberate, and then it rose. At first he thought it was a shape forming in the liquid itself, but as it surfaced, he saw the truth. Skin stretched over cartilage-like plates, covered in thin, hair-like tendrils that writhed as if tasting the air. Two eyes, human in shape, but black and depthless, blinked open and fixed on him. The voice came again, but now it was not in his head. It rolled out of the creature's mouth like water over stone. "You are late." Henry's knees weakened. He wanted to flee, but his legs held him frozen. The thing continued. "Your bloodline swore by the tide. Your father fed me until his lungs filled with salt. Now you will finish what he began." The basin trembled as the creature shifted, its form impossible to fully see in the dim light. Too many limbs, too many joints bending the wrong way. Around the edges of the chamber, Henry saw other basins, smaller, each with bones piled neatly within. He understood. This was not an offering. This was a larder. The voice dropped lower, almost a growl. "Speak my name, and the sea will rise for you. Deny me, and it will take you, piece by piece." Henry realized that the name was already in his mouth, as though the creature had placed it there long ago, waiting for this exact moment. He clenched his jaw shut. The chamber went silent. Then, in one sudden motion, the creature lunged forward, its face stopping inches from his own, tendrils brushing his skin. "You cannot leave without paying." Behind him, the stairwell was already closing. The preacher's voice was the first thing Henry heard when the vision ended. It didn't come from a pulpit or from any living throat. It came from the walls themselves, resonating through the soaked timber, as if the entire house had been forced to memorize his sermons and now recited them on its own. The words were wrong. They began like scripture but turned sour midway, twisting into something that had no place in a church. "Blessed are those who open the deep, for they shall inherit the tide." Henry pressed his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't entering through his ears. It was rising through his ribs, vibrating in the cavity of his chest, until he could feel each syllable in his lungs. The floor swelled under his boots, a slow, pulsing rise, as if the planks themselves were breathing with the rhythm of the prayer. The wallpaper blistered, each bubble stretching like skin before it split, releasing the stench of brine and rot. Henry stumbled back toward the desk, but the letters had changed again. The seal was gone. In its place was a single page, the ink still wet, written in a hand he recognized instantly, because it was his own. It read, "You will finish what I could not. The debt is written in your blood." The voice in the walls laughed then, not loud, not manic, but a quiet, satisfied exhalation, like a fisherman pulling in a net heavy with catch. He thought of running. He thought of smashing the jar with the eye. He thought of burning the entire estate to the ground. But the voice spoke once more, and every thought scattered. "Do not fear, Henry. You are not the first to pray here, but you will be the last." From somewhere below, in the black flooded corridors under the estate, something answered with a sound that was not a word, but a hunger. And Henry knew that the prayer was still being said, and it would not stop until it was finished. Henry descended the cellar steps with a lantern that felt far too small for the blackness below. Each step was slick, not with water, but with a film of something oily, like seawater that had rotted. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of low tide, not the fresh tang of the ocean, but the stench of something dredged from the deep and left to decay. At the base of the stairs, the cellar opened into a chamber that should not have existed. Its walls were not brick or stone, but carved basalt, slick with condensation. The pattern of the carvings was unmistakable, a ring of spirals, each one pointing inward toward a hollow depression in the floor that shimmered with black water. Henry's lantern flame guttered, but it did not go out. He knelt and dipped his fingers into the water. It was warm. The moment his skin touched it, visions slammed into him like a wave. He saw Charleston, 1859, the city choked in fog, the harbor unnaturally still. A congregation in the Caldwell Chapel, each person with eyes closed, chanting in unison. At the center stood the preacher, not the holy man from the portraits upstairs, but something changed. His eyes reflected light like a shark's. His hands dripped seawater, though he had touched no basin. The preacher spoke to the congregation, but his words were not his own. They rolled like surf, layered with the groan of a leviathan. "We have bound the tide in blood. Every generation shall feed it, one of your own, taken, given, swallowed, so that the city may stand, and the sea shall not reclaim it." The vision shifted. Henry saw the first offering, a young Caldwell boy, hands bound, led into the chamber by his own father. The boy's tears steamed on the black water before he was pulled beneath without a ripple. Year after year, name after name, the Caldwells were not victims of the thing beneath Charleston. They were its keepers. Hay had made a covenant, safety, wealth, and influence for the city, in exchange for their own bloodline, thinned and sacrificed, one child at a time. The final vision struck hardest. It was Henry's father, younger, terrified, standing where Henry now stood. And in front of him, a small boy with Henry's face. The preacher's voice again. "Not yet. The debt skips a generation, but it always returns." Henry tore his hands from the water, gasping. The lantern light caught movement in the pool, not a reflection, not a fish, but an eye, vast and patient, looking up at him from somewhere far below. It did not blink. It did not retreat. It waited. Henry stumbled backward from the black pool, his boots scraping against the slick basalt floor. His pulse was thunder in his ears, but beneath it he heard something else, a sound so faint it was almost imagined. It was the sea. Not the crashing roar of waves, but the murmur of water in a cavern, the hush of an undertow dragging something away. And hidden within that sound was a name. At first, it was impossible to make out. The syllables bled together, drawn out by the liquid whisper. Then, like the tide rolling back to reveal something buried, it came clear. Eli. Henry froze. His nephew, just 7 years old. The boy had been left in Henry's care after his sister's sudden death last year. Innocent, gentle, obsessed with drawing ships in the margins of his school books. The whisper came again, more insistent now. "Eli Caldwell. The debt must be paid." Henry's stomach turned cold. His family was gone, his bloodline thinned, but the covenant had survived, and now it was reaching for the only piece left that could fulfill it. The air in the cellar thickened, the carvings on the walls seemed to pulse, the spirals tightening toward the black water as though drawing breath. Henry could feel something rising from far below. He turned and fled up the steps, the lantern swinging wildly. At the top, the old chapel above the cellar was lit with a dim, amber glow. Every pew was filled, men and women he recognized from town, the shopkeeper who'd smiled at him that morning, the harbor master, the woman who ran the post office. They sat in silence, their heads all turning toward him in the same slow motion. Their eyes glimmered, catching the candlelight in a way that was not natural. The man in the front row, a stooped elder with a face like driftwood, spoke. "Henry Caldwell," he said, his voice calm. "The tide has taken much from your bloodline. Tonight it asks on, lie for what is owed." Henry's throat was dry. "You mean to kill him? My nephew?" The elder did not blink. "We mean to keep the sea where it belongs. You've seen the waters, haven't you? You've heard it. Do you think Charleston has been spared the storms by chance?" Another voice came from the back. "Every time a Caldwell hesitated, the harbor claimed more than it was owed. In '59, the preacher vanished because your kin failed to act. The sea nearly took the whole lower ward." The congregation rose as one, their shadows stretching along the chapel walls like the arms of something vast and reaching. The elder's final words were almost a prayer. "Bring the boy to the tide, Henry, or the tide will come for him itself. And for you." Henry's mind spun. This was no mere superstition. This was a machine of fear and tradition, fed by the oldest hunger of all, the kind that wears patience like armor. And outside, though the sky was clear, he could hear the distant, steady sound of waves growing closer. Henry's descent into the lowest chamber of the Caldwell estate was not a walk. It was a surrender. The air grew heavier with each step, until every breath was a negotiation. The lantern in his hand spat and hissed, its flame shrinking as if afraid of what it might reveal. The steps ended in a circular stone chamber, knee-deep in black water. The walls were carved with the same spirals he'd seen upstairs, only here. They were deeper, fresher, as though chiseled not decades ago, but yesterday. And in the center, a chair. It was not the ornate, gilded kind you'd expect from a wealthy family's relic. It was a crude, high-backed thing of iron and wood, bolted to the stone floor. And in that chair sat a man who was almost a man. His skin was grey as driftwood. His hair hung in ropes, slick with the film of the tide, but it was the eyes, lidless, unblinking, pale as fish belly, that made Henry's throat tighten. The figure smiled when it saw him, not with lips, but with the bare movement of cheek and bone. "Henry," it said, the voice matching every story, every recorded sermon, every portrait. "You came back." It was the preacher, not dead, not gone, preserved or cursed in a half-life that time had stopped acknowledging. Henry's first instinct was to demand answers, but the preacher spoke over him, each word dripping with a kind of fatherly authority that left no room for interruption. "The tide remembers what it is owed. The family failed. They stopped the offerings. They tried to bury the covenant beneath lies. And now you, the last Caldwell, will either pay the debt or drown in it." As the preacher's voice filled the chamber, the water around Henry's legs began to stir. It wasn't the natural lap of waves. It was purposeful, circling, as if something beneath the surface was deciding. "You will make the choice, boy," the preacher whispered. "But know that isn't the one who never leaves, always gets what he came for." The lantern died. The darkness did not feel empty. When the lantern's flame died, Henry expected to be swallowed by silence. Instead, the preacher's voice remained, smooth, deliberate, cutting through the dark like a blade drawn slow. "Do you know what they promised me, Henry, when the first stone of this house was laid?" There was a sound in the water, not splashing, breathing, something unseen inhaling, slow and deep beneath the surface around his legs. "They promised blood," the preacher continued. "One life, every season, given freely or taken by force. In exchange, the tides would stay out, the storms would pass, and the Caldwells would prosper." Henry's throat tightened. He had read fragments of the old family journals, thought the talk of tide sacrifices was metaphor, superstition, but here it was, breathing beneath his knees. The preacher shifted in the iron chair. The sound of wet wood groaned like bones settling. Your father broke the chain. He thought faith was stronger than debt, and so the water came for him. Then your mother, then the rest. But you, the voice lowered, almost tender, you still have a choice. Henry's pulse hammered against his skull. What choice? He asked, his voice catching in the cavern's stale air. The preacher leaned forward, or perhaps the darkness leaned with him. One life, Henry. It does not have to be yours. Henry's mind recoiled, but the preacher did not stop. Bring me a name, a body, before the next full tide. Do this, and the Caldwell bloodline will rise again. Your coffers will swell, your enemies will drown, your name will be whispered with the old respect. The water around Henry was no longer still. It lapped against him in slow, deliberate pulses, like a patient hand pressing against a wound. Refuse, the preacher said, and the tide will not wait for another season. It will take you tonight, piece by piece, breath by breath. Henry realized that the true horror. This wasn't an ultimatum. This was an invitation. The preacher wasn't asking for a victim. He was offering Henry a crown. In the pitch black, Henry felt the weight of generations pressing on his shoulders. The legacy was not one of honor or faith. It was one of payment, and now the debt was his to settle. The water rose. The choice had to be made. The cavern let him go like a reluctant hand releasing prey. When Henry emerged into the midnight air, the ocean roared at his back, but it felt quieter than the pounding in his head. Every step through the marsh felt heavier, not from fatigue, but from the preacher's words curling like smoke through his thoughts. One life. It does not have to be yours. The moon was low, silvering the wet grass, and the town of Charleston slept beyond the dunes. Lamps burned dim in only a handful of windows. Ordinary lives, unaware of the hunger waiting beneath the tide. Henry's boots squelched with every step, water still seeping from his coat. In his mind, names began to surface. Not random, never random. The preacher's bargain demanded value. The offering had to matter, a life that could be weighed on a scale and deemed worthy of the ocean's attention. He thought first of Edmund Shaw, the banker who had strangled his family's fortune over the past decade, one cruel loan at a time. A man who had smiled as he signed the paper that stripped Henry of the last Caldwell property. Yes, Edmund would make a fitting sacrifice. But then another name rose. Margaret Lane, the widow who had whispered poison into every ear about his family's madness, who had gone to the courts to challenge the Caldwell's inheritance, who had spoken of his father's death not with grief, but with satisfaction. The preacher's promise rang louder, your enemies will drown. Henry paused in the street, staring at the narrow alley that led to Margaret's home. He could hear the faint clink of bottles from a tavern 2 blocks away, smell the faint tang of coal smoke from the shipyard. The town was alive enough to tempt him with witnesses, but quiet enough that shadows could swallow a man whole. Yet there was something else gnawing at him, a colder thought. If this debt was to be paid again, year after year, well, is it wise to waste the first offering on vengeance alone? Or should he offer someone whose absence would go unnoticed, someone disposable? That's when he thought of Thomas, the young dockhand who had stumbled drunk into the marsh last winter and told the whole wharf he'd seen a man with no shadow under the Caldwell pier. The boy had survived the cold that night, but not the rumor that followed. His words had nearly driven Henry to violence. Nearly. The preacher's bargain turned every heartbeat into a calculation. Who would buy the most time? Whose death would keep the tide from his own door longest? Henry reached his home, the last Caldwell house standing, and stood in the doorway, dripping salt water onto the warped floorboards. He looked at the empty dining table, the portraits staring down at him from cracked frames. He whispered the name once, just to hear how it sounded in the air. And in the silence after, he could swear he heard the tide shift, as if the ocean had heard him, and approved. The night Henry chose was neither stormy nor calm. It was the kind of night the sea seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with salt. The moon, bloated and low, cast a pale path across the water that looked almost deliberate, as if it were pointing the way. Henry moved through the streets like a shadow that had grown tired of following its owner. In his hand, the length of hemp rope felt like a verdict. The chosen name, whispered and sealed, still lingered in his mouth like the taste of blood. He found Thomas in the only place Thomas could be found at this hour, slouched against a tavern wall, half drunk, humming something broken and tuneless. The boy didn't notice Henry until the rope slid over his shoulders. By then it was too late. Henry's voice was low, calm, almost kind. "Walk with me." Fear sobered Thomas faster than any prayer. He obeyed, stumbling through the alleys, the sound of the sea growing louder with every step. The marsh swallowed them in its damp black arms, reeds hissing in the wind. When they reached the shore, Henry forced him to his knees. The tide was already advancing, the moonlight catching each wave's crest like a silver blade. The preacher's words were in his head now, not as a whisper, but as a command. One life, to buy your own. Thomas began to beg, messy, desperate, slurred with drink and terror. Henry didn't listen. He bound the boy's hands, his movements mechanical, detached, like a priest preparing an altar. Each knot felt like an echo of the ones he had seen in the cavern on the preacher's wrists. When the tide reached Henry's boots, he began to drag Thomas forward. The boy screamed, his voice carrying over the water, but something strange happened. The wind shifted and the sound seemed to vanish into the night. The sea swallowed it. At knee-deep, Thomas's panic turned animal. He thrashed, cursed, cried out names. But the water rose faster than he could scream them. The waves reached his chest, then his chin. His eyes locked on Henry's, wide, pleading, until the last moment when they went under. Henry held him there, not out of cruelty, out of necessity, out of the contract. When the last bubble surfaced and burst, the tide seemed to pause, and then recede, pulling Thomas's body into the deep, as if claiming property already purchased. Henry stood alone in the moonlit water, heart hammering. And then he felt it. The tide around his legs shifted, not naturally, but with intention, curling around him like fingers. It was warm, alive, and in that moment, he understood the preacher's final unspoken truth. The tide did not just take, it marked. He walked back to shore without looking behind him, but in his bones he knew. The water had recognized him, and it would not forget. Morning in Charleston always began with the same rhythm. Shutters opening, vendors calling, gulls crying over the harbor. But this morning, something was wrong. The air felt heavy, not with heat, but with the kind of silence that sits behind sound, waiting. Henry woke before dawn, though he hadn't really slept. His hands still smelled faintly of salt and rope. The echo of the tide's grip on his legs still throbbed in his muscles, as if the water had left fingerprints. He dressed slowly, his ears straining for something he couldn't name. The first knock came just as the sun's edge crested the horizon. It wasn't frantic. It was soft, hesitant, almost polite. But when Henry opened the door, he saw the eyes of a man who didn't know how to say the thing he'd come to say. "You hear about Thomas?" the man asked. Henry didn't answer. The man went on, his voice dropping. "Didn't make it home last night. Folks think he's still sleeping off a bottle, but his mother says his bed's been cold since dusk." Henry felt the words sink into him like lead shot. Not guilt, that wasn't allowed to surface, but the awareness that the town had begun its slow turn towards suspicion. By midday, the whispers had spread like oil across water. Thomas's name was on every tongue, first in concern, then in speculation, then in quiet accusation. A few swore they'd heard him singing near the docks after midnight. Others claimed they saw him headed toward the marshes. No one mentioned Henry, not yet, but the sea did. It began with the gulls. By noon, they were gone. Not a single wing over the harbor, not a single cry above the market. The absence was louder than their presence had ever been. Then came the smell, not the usual brine, but something thicker, like iron and decay. It rolled in from the water in slow, deliberate waves. Fishermen returning from the morning catch spoke of nets, booming up empty, of the water being strangely warm, of shadows moving under the surface that didn't belong to fish. One man swore he'd seen a shape following his boat just under the waterline, pale, human, with eyes wide open. By evening, the town had changed. Doors closed earlier, lamps were lit sooner, the streets emptied before the tide came in. And Henry. Henry stood at his window watching the water creep back into the harbor. That's when he saw it. A dark shape, just at the edge of the moon's reflection, drifting toward the shore. It bobbed once, twice, then rolled enough for the light to catch it. A face. Bloated, unblinking, mouth open as if still screaming. Thomas. The tide was delivering him back. But as the waves pushed the body toward the pilings, something else moved beneath it, something that didn't rise, didn't surface, but lingered, circling. Henry stepped back from the window. His chest was tight, but not from fear alone. No, there was something else inside him now, a pulse, a rhythm, and it matched the sea. By 1866, the corridors of the Sullivan Institute were quieter, but not in a peaceful way. They were quiet like the moments before a storm, when the air feels too heavy to breathe. The townsfolk of Millbrook had stopped talking openly about Dr. Cornelius Sullivan, not because they had forgotten him, but because his name had become a weight in the mouth, a word that tasted of iron and blood. But behind the walls of the Institute, the doctor's work had reached a new stage. What began as medical research had evolved, no longer purely about healing, no longer about discovery, but about control. He believed that knowledge was not meant for all, that only those with the will to bear the truth should hold it. And in his mind, he was the sole arbiter of who deserved it. The patients were no longer patients. They were subjects. Some volunteered, seduced by promises of health or a better life. Others had no choice, the forgotten, the voiceless, the ones no one would come looking for. To the doctor, they were pages in a book he was writing with flesh and bone. One of the most whispered legends was the room without windows. A chamber deep beneath the east wing, lit only by oil lamps that smoked the air black. No one outside the doctor's inner circle knew exactly what took place there. Some claimed it was where Sullivan conducted experiments on the limits of the human mind, how far it could be stretched before it broke. Others said it was where he stored his failures, preserved in jars like macabre trophies. It was in this room that Sullivan's philosophy solidified, that suffering was the ultimate teacher. He spoke to his apprentices in the same cold tone he used when holding a scalpel. Pain is the mother of truth. The ones who survive it deserve to know it. The rest are not worth the burden. His young assistants, some ambitious, some terrified, began to emulate his but turned. They too started keeping their own secret records, their own lists of subjects who passed and those who failed. But outside the Institute, a shadow was growing. Families had begun asking questions. Local pastors whispered sermons about unnatural works and the arrogance of man. The sheriff's office received anonymous letters, some written in shaky hands, describing screams in the night, strange smells of burning chemicals and wagons arriving at the back gates under the cover of darkness. The most chilling part was that every time someone tried to investigate, they either vanished or came back. Different, hollow-eyed, silent. As if a part of them had been extracted and locked away. It became clear to those few who dared think about it that Sullivan wasn't simply experimenting on individuals. He was testing society itself, testing how much horror people would tolerate before they acted. And so far, the answer had been a lot. The true price of knowledge was becoming visible. It was not written in books or kept in locked cabinets. It was etched into the faces of those who survived his care, if you could call it survival. The Institute no longer felt like a hospital, it felt like an altar, and Sullivan was its high priest, offering up human lives to the God of forbidden truth. And yet, For those who knew him, there was always the question that kept them awake at night. If you had the chance to learn what he knew, even at the cost he demanded, would you take it? Because Sullivan's whispered promise to his chosen few was always the same: once you know, you will never be powerless again. History has a cruel way of erasing names while keeping the sins they carried. By the late summer of 1849, the Medical Institute of Horror in Kentucky had become a phantom. The building abandoned, its windows shattered, its records burned. To the ordinary eye, it was nothing but a forgotten ruin, but to those who understood the truth, it was a scar on the land. The name of Dr. Cornelius Sullivan was no longer spoken in polite company, yet in whispers, in the back rooms of gentlemen's clubs, in the candlelit halls of Masonic lodges, in the private gatherings of men who dealt in secrets, Sullivan's reputation had transformed from that of a disgraced physician to something darker. He was no longer a doctor. He was a legend, a symbol of the belief that power could be extracted from the very essence of human suffering. What few realized was that Sullivan's work didn't end with the collapse of his institute. His graduates, the apprentices who had studied under him, had scattered across the country. Each carried with them fragments of his methods: the experimental surgeries, the use of fear as a weapon, the breaking of the human will in the name of science. Some became physicians, others hid their skills under the guise of respectable trades, but all of them kept experimenting. The legacy was not just medical, it was ideological. Sullivan taught his disciples one unshakable truth: control the body and you control the soul. Control the soul and you control the future. This teaching did not die in the ashes of the institute. It seeped into new institutions, asylums, prisons, and secret medical facilities run under government contracts. The same hands that once held surgical blades in Sullivan's basement now wore the gloves of official authority. By the 1850s, rumors began to surface of strange practices in rural hospitals and military infirmaries. Soldiers' wagons whispered of black rooms where no patient ever returned. Families spoke of loved ones sent to recover who came back silent, empty. The techniques were refined, the tools modernized, but the seed of the work was pure Sullivan. And here lies the truth most people will never accept. The destruction of the Institute was never meant to erase what happened. It was meant to spread it, to decentralize it. The powerful knew that housing such darkness in one place made it a target, but scatter it into the shadows of respectable institutions, then it would survive for generations. Dr. Sullivan himself was last reportedly seen in 1851 boarding a ship to Europe under a false name. Some say he went to Paris to study with surgeons who pushed the limits of anatomy. Others insist he was seen in Vienna, visiting the psychiatric wards where doctors experimented with sensory deprivation and psychological torture. And there are even darker whispers that he was recruited into a circle of European aristocrats who believed pain was the purest currency of the human spirit. Whatever became of him, the mark he left on Kentucky and on America never faded. Even today, there are physicians who speak of the old methods, of ways to reach into the human mind and rewire it in ways no medicine could. They don't mention his name. They don't need to. His work has become a silent foundation under modern systems of control. And that is the real horror. Not that a man like Sullivan existed, but that his legacy has no grave, no final resting place. It is alive, in the institutions that decide what happens to the weak, the sick, and the forgotten. The institute is gone, but the ideology walks among us. Because the truth is, when you cut into a man's flesh, the wound may heal, but when you cut into his soul, the scar becomes eternal. There comes a moment in every investigation when the truth is so heavy, so corrosive, that speaking it aloud feels like unleashing a curse. This is that moment. I told you from the beginning that the story of Dr. Cornelius Sullivan was not merely about a man or his institute or even the grotesque experiments that stained Kentucky soil in 1845. No, this has always been about something larger, something older, something that moves in the shadows of history like a predator, patient and calculating. Because if you believe that the Medical Institute of Horror was dismantled after the scandal, then you've fallen into the same comfortable lie that has lulled countless generations into ignorance. The building may have been torn down, the walls may have crumbled, the grounds may have been abandoned, but the work, the method, survived. It survived because men like Sullivan were never lone madmen. They were instruments, tools wielded by forces that thrive on secrecy, manipulation, and control. Sullivan was a surgeon of flesh, yes, but his real work was the surgery of the mind, and once that blade has been forged, it is never discarded. After his disappearance in 1851, rumors swirled that he had fled overseas. Others claimed he died in the backwoods, a victim of the very diseases he once tried to cure or create. But the more I followed the trail, the more I saw his fingerprints in other places, in unexplained outbreaks, in sudden surges of medical experimentation in remote corners of the country, in whispers of a society of advancement that moved its laboratories like nomads, setting up in forgotten towns before vanishing without a trace. And then there is the sealed ledger. Buried in the archives of a private collection in New York, bound in cracked leather, the ledger carries Sullivan's handwriting. Inside are lists, patients, subjects, specimens, some of the names remarked with a strange sigil in the margin, a looping spiral enclosed in a triangle. It is not a medical symbol, it is a mark of ownership. These names, some belong to the dead, some belong to people who, according to the dates, should have lived over a century ago, and yet the handwriting beside them describes behaviors, symptoms, and physical conditions that were logged only in the last few decades. It's as if these subjects are not bound by time in the way we understand it. The final page of the ledger holds a single sentence scrawled in a hand far less steady than the rest. The Institute is never a place, it is a condition. That's when it hit me. We've been looking for buildings, basements, and locked doors, but the Institute doesn't need walls. It exists wherever a certain mindset takes root. The mindset that sees people not as souls, but as resources, that strips away humanity in the name of progress, that plays God behind closed doors. Dr. Sullivan's disappearance was not the end of the story. It was the perfect cover. By vanishing, he ensured that the work could continue unchallenged, hidden in plain sight, wearing 1,000 different masks. And perhaps it still is. Think about the sudden vanishings you've heard about in your own lifetime. Think about the experimental trials that are quietly shut down without explanation. Think about the whispers of research facilities where no one is allowed to speak. These are not isolated incidents. They are echoes of the Institute. The question isn't whether Sullivan is dead or alive. The question is whether you've already crossed paths with his legacy and didn't even realize it. The curtain falls here, but the stage remains. And somewhere, right now, the scalpel gleams under the light, the ink dries in a new ledger, and a name, maybe a name you know, is being written down. The Institute is not G1. It is waiting. And when it knocks, you will have to decide whether to open the door